I'm Jonah Comstock, Editor-in-Chief of Pharma Forum. I'm here on the sidelines of JP Morgan at the Donatello Hotel with Gene Kinney, the CEO of Prothena.
Thank you for having me.
And Gene, we did this last year.
We did, yes.
JP Morgan 2023.
Indeed.
So really quick, in case folks have forgotten, give us the background on the company, but then let's talk about what's new.
Yeah, great, thank you. So I'm the CEO of Prothena. Prothena is a biotechnology company focused on diseases caused by misfolded proteins. So, as a reminder, we talked about this last year. Every cell in your body every day is making protein, right? And protein has to fold in a certain way in space, in a certain 3 dimensions, in order to bind to other protein and do whatever it is it's supposed to do. But on occasion, that process goes awry. And when that happens, those proteins can misfold and take on an abnormal conformation, which can in fact be toxic to cells and organs and tissue. And when that happens, we see disease. So what we focus on at Prothena is the intervention of that biology that's gone awry in order to preserve function, and in the case of disease, to interact with that protein and to ameliorate the disease process. And so that's taken us into a bunch of interesting areas. So there are peripheral diseases outside of the brain, which are known as systemic amyloid diseases. We have programs, a phase 3 program for a disease known as AL amyloidosis. And we can talk a little bit about that, but those data from that phase 3 study are going to read out here in the next, call it 12 to 18 months. So we're excited about that. We have another program where we work with our partners at Novo Nordisk on a disease called ATTR amyloidosis, which is a different protein, also outside of the brain in the periphery, which leads to disease. And they'll be testing that in the phase 2 study. And we expect some results from that study this year. And then in the central nervous system, we can talk about larger prevalent diseases, such as Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, and the like. And we have a number of programs in both Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease, much of which we'll be getting data on this year as well. So we're excited about this year. We're excited about where the portfolio is. And of course, we continue to investigate the science around that.
Parkinson's and Alzheimer's were very hot topics at JP Morgan last year. I haven't heard as much this year, although it's early, it's day one. But there were some major stories and some breakthroughs and commercializations this year. Where do we stand with that? What are people excited about going into 2024, and what are some of the main kind of places where progress was made this year?
Yeah, no, thanks for the question.
Last year.
Yeah, no, it is an exciting time in Alzheimer's disease. So with, in the previous several years, what we've seen is a shift in terms of how we think about treatment of Alzheimer's disease, from purely symptomatic agents that really treat the symptoms but don't really affect the underlying progressive disease, to disease-modifying agents, so things that actually slow the progression of the disease by impacting the underlying disease biology. And that's a pretty exciting kind of paradigm shift as you think about it. We've seen a drug from Eisai be approved exactly for that indication in Alzheimer's disease. This is a drug known as lecanemab. And we have other drugs now that are undergoing FDA evaluations, such as the drug from Eli Lilly, known as donanemab. So we think that's exciting. Those drugs, I think, are the front wave of a whole new class of disease-modifying agents for a number of neurodegenerative disorders, but specifically in this case, Alzheimer's disease. Now, where we think this field goes from here is equally exciting, because obviously when you have a first-in-class approach that kind of changes the treatment paradigm, you can start to think about how we then move that science forward, as we have in many other fields like HIV, like oncology. So it's an exciting moment when a field gets to that space. In our portfolio, for example, we have a potential therapeutic known as PRX12, which targets a similar type of protein as those other 2 agents I talked about, but we've designed it in a way where it can be given once monthly subcutaneously, so a little bit more convenient for a patient, and hopefully will help patients to better comply with those treatments and better the impact. And so that's something we'll be exploring as we move through our clinical program. We think from there's a potential that you start to see combination approaches. So once you have an impact, you can start to think combining other biologies on top of that to see if you can forward the efficacy profile. And one of the things very exciting in Alzheimer's disease is also the potential to think about this disease not just based on the cluster of clinical symptoms, but to think about it based on its biology. And that allows you to start talking about pre-symptomatic Alzheimer's disease patients and what you might be able to do to intervene in that space. So we're starting to see the field move there as well. And so I think across the board, thinking about pushing forward the efficacy profile and pushing back in time where you can start to intervene makes for an exciting kind of 1-2 punch in the context of Alzheimer's disease. For our part at Prothena, we have a monoclonal antibody that targets amyloid beta, and of course that's the molecule I just referred to. It's a molecule that goes by the name of PRX12. But also, and we just announced in a press release today, a vaccine, an active vaccine that targets both the amyloid beta protein as well as another protein known as tau, that we think could be potentially very exciting in this space. So we look forward to updating the community maybe a little bit later this year as to when we're going to actually take that vaccine forward and into clinical trials.
Wow, that's fascinating. So you mentioned pre-symptomatic intervention, and that kind of also brings us into the biomarker problem, right? Where how do you study these interventions, and how do you know if they're working and prove that they're working when you're pre-symptomatic? So what's your approach there?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think some of the advances in the biomarker space in Alzheimer's disease have been really remarkable over the last several years. One of the things we're seeing, for example, is a shift from using non-invasive brain imaging to blood-based biomarkers. So things that actually reflect what's happening in the CNS around some of these key proteins. And seeing that, in fact, some of those markers are very dynamic and sensitive to change. And so that's very important as we start to think about pre-symptomatic patients who maybe have the requisite biology, but not yet the clinical symptoms of the disease. And then, of course, what you're hoping you can do by intervening at that stage is to either slow or altogether prevent the progression to that symptomatic stage. That's particularly important in diseases of the central nervous system, because when we lose brain cells, those tend not to come back. And so what we want to do is intervene as early as possible so that we can preserve as much function as possible, which means the earlier we can detect the onset of these diseases on a biological basis, the more likely we are to be able to start to think about intervening even at that time frame.
So I'm going to change the subject a little bit,
okay.
To another topic I'm asking everybody about, really, is AI. How has it changed what you do, how you do what you do over the last year?
Well, I think on several folds. So certainly there are a number of companies that have started around AI technology in terms of target selection, thinking about how to better model and approach the way we select targets and target biology. How might certain proteins, for example, how might we model what they do when they go awry and when they start to become aberrant in the context of disease? So I think that that's an important understanding and things that we can leverage into our biological understanding of how the normal biology turns into abnormal biology. And I think that's critically important. On I think a more operational level, of course, AI can be very helpful just in terms of keeping the operational wheel spinning in a more efficient way. And I think incorporating that in a responsible way into an organization around thinking about databases, collecting, collating data, making sense of certain data sets that are rich in information is also an important way that one can incorporate AI into your normal kind of everyday work life.
Big picture, looking ahead to the year 2024, anything you're looking forward to, excited about, hopeful for?
Yeah.
Either specifically with Prothena or even more broadly in the industry level.
Yeah, no, well, let me start with Prothena. We're very excited about 2024. Across our portfolio, we have important readouts coming. I mentioned a phase 3 study. A phase 3, obviously, are the more advanced phases of clinical trial. We have a wholly owned asset called bertamimab in a phase 3 study where, if positive, we expect to enter into discussions with regulators and hopefully bring that to market. That data we just updated today. We expect sometime between the fourth quarter of this year through to somewhere around second quarter of 2025. So we look forward to that program continuing and collecting data there. We have a drug that we're working on with Roche. It's a drug by the name of prasinezumab. It's intended to slow the progression of Parkinson's disease. So we're very excited about that drug. They're conducting a phase 2b study known as the PADOVA study. And we expect that data to come in based on their estimates also this year. So we'll learn more about that program and where that molecule is. We're working with Novo Nordisk on an ATTR amyloidosis program. They're running a phase 2 study in cardiomyopathy to understand the potential benefit of intervention in cardiomyopathy patients that have ATTR amyloidosis. We expect that data this year. And on our Alzheimer's portfolio, we expect to update a little bit more on timing around the start of our vaccine studies this year. So we'll talk a little bit more about when we expect to start those studies. And of course, our molecule PRX12, which we've talked about a little bit, we will start to talk about more comprehensive data sets this year as we continue to enroll additional cohorts. So a very exciting year for us. I think across the industry, we see progress in a number of different areas. Certainly in the CNS space, there continues to be a lot of progress in Alzheimer's disease, which we'll be paying attention to quite focused way. But also in neuropsychiatry, we're seeing a lot of advances in this space. So treatments for symptomatic portions of these diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson, but also in depression, schizophrenia in that space. We're seeing some very exciting data, as you can imagine, with the GLP and molecules in areas of obesity, and not just obesity, but then what that means to other aspects of life. And so I think there's a lot of really interesting work happening across the board. Coming full circle back to Alzheimer's disease, I'll just say there's also a lot of work that we're going to see kind of come to fruition this year around other aspects of Alzheimer's disease, not just these key proteins, but things like neuroinflammation and other things that contribute to Alzheimer's disease and what intervening in those processes might do. So we're looking forward to seeing those data from other companies as well. So it takes a village to make a real impact on some of these complex diseases, and we're encouraged that there's a lot of interest by a lot of companies in the space focused on that. And so we'll be watching and very much looking forward to positive updates across the field.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Gene. Really appreciate the chance to catch up a second time and get some updates.
Yeah, it's good to see you again.
Maybe I'll see you next year.
Hopefully so. Good to see you. Thank you.